Hello viewers, welcome to week 3, lecture 4 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and in this lecture I am going to talk about the Russian formalism. So I will be introducing you to the development of this movement and historical evolution of this movement that happened during the first half of the 20th century. Uh, we have already talked about two schools of criticism, uh, New Criticism and Chicago School of Criticism. And in those two schools, we have seen that what are differences between them. For example, how New Criticism focused its attention on the language of the literary text in context of their favorite terms such as paradox, irony, ambiguity, gesture, texture, structure, etc. Similarly, we read about Chicago critics that how if new critics were a priori in their approach towards literature, the Chicago critics were a posteriori. If new criticism is known for its monism, Chicago critics, they developed their pluralistic approach towards literature. So once we are well grounded in the basics of formalistic approaches to literature via those movements, now it is opportune moment to start our discussion of Russian formalism. So as we know that Russian formalist school flourished in Russia from 1914 we can say to 1930s. It can be taken as the early phase of this movement, right? And after that, this movement developed at other places and how it gave birth to other movements like structuralism. The rise of structuralism can be directly related to this movement, right? So the centers of this movement were Moscow and St. Petersburg, and we find that in this movement how Russian formalists focus on the language of literature. They are concerned with developing a science of literature, right? So the chief exponents of this movement are Victor Shklovsky, Boris Eichenbaum, Roman Jakobson, Jan Mukarovsky, Yuri Tinyanev, Boris Tomaszewski, right? So these critics, they are associated with this movement, and Russian formalists were very much like new critics in their approach towards literature, in the sense that they also focus on the language of literature. They talked about the autonomy of literature. They talked about the decontextualization of literature, right? They were interested in the question that what is specifically literary in text, right? So here we find that how they have a very detailed empirical approach to reading, but their method is very distinct from new critics. We will be focusing on what are the distinctions between new critics and Russian formalists in the subsequent slides. For example, if new critics focused on the verbal ordering of a text, for example, they talk about the arrangement of language in a text, and in arrangement of that language, how they focus on different literary devices or figures of speech, and in context of those figures of speech, they try to analyze that work of art, right? They also believe that a poem with all its linguistic complexity or as a linguistic structure also addresses the questions about human life. It may be taken as a subtle response to human life, right? So they emphasized a closed reading of the text that we have seen, explication the text, and while doing that, they always believe that a text is fundamentally, oriented around a humanistic theme. They can find a kind of artistic or organic unity in a text, and in this way, to some extent, there are some moral implications. Despite their decontextualizing of the text, these moral implications, they creep in their literary discussions that we have seen in that particular lecture on new critics discussing literature as a special kind of knowledge, right? But, for example, if we look at Clint Brooks, he says that Marvel's Horatian Ode, it is not a statement on the political condition of society. Rather, it is a dramatized, version of opposed views, and he looks at it as a poetic whole, not directly related to the socio-political condition of society. Similarly, he goes on to say that how the poem embodies honesty, insight, and whole-mindedness. When we look at these words like honesty or integrity or whole-mindedness, we find that this humanistic element is always there, to some extent present, right? But so far as Russian formalists are concerned, in this way they can be distinguished from the new critics. For Russian formalists, this human content of a poem is of no significance, right? So it has no role in determining the literariness of a text. So emotions, ideas, or any kind of reference of that text to the external reality, all these questions become redundant in their analysis of literature, right? So, for them, the only important thing in analysis of a text are poetic or literary devices, right? So, for them, this aesthetic form of literature has no moral value or any kind of ethical significance. In this way, they can be, distinguished from the new critics. So, in a way, Russian formalists are very much a part of that early 20th century developments that we see in the 20th century, right? And they develop their own methods, models, and hypotheses, and they are debating the question that how aesthetic effects are produced by these literary devices, right? So, in this way, Russian formalism is also one or unanimous with new criticism or Chicago School of Criticism, which approach the biohistorical approaches which had developed in the later part of the 19th century, right? So, there we can understand this distinction between the expressive criticism which was prevailing in the 19th century and objective criticism which was propounded by the Russian formalists or new critics and Chicago critics, these formalists. So, let us have a look at the distinction between expressive criticism and objective criticism. So, expressive criticism defines poetry as an expression or overflow or utterance of feeling, or as the product of the poet's imagination operating on his perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. It tends to judge the work by its sincerity or genuineness or adequacy to the poet's individual vision or state of mind. And it often looks in the work for evidences of the particular temperament and experiences of the author, who consciously or unconsciously has revealed himself in it. Such views were developed mainly by Romantic critics, and they remained widely current in the early part of the 20th century. So, we can find that against this kind of expressive criticism or impressionistic approaches, right, which were prevailing during the 19th century. We have already talked about in the previous lectures about impressionism, that how a work of art is always analyzed in context of what kind of impression it creates on the mind of the reader. So the reader is important and text is secondary in that way. So in this way, against such impressionistic and expressive approaches, these formalists, they propound their theory of objective criticism. So what is objective criticism? These approaches, on the contrary, for these approaches, objective criticism approaches the work as something which stands free from the poet, audience, or environing world. It describes the literary product as a self-sufficient object or integer, or as a world in itself, which is to be analyzed and judged by intrinsic criteria such as complexity, coherence, equilibrium, integrity, and the interrelationships of its component elements. This is the characteristic approach of a number of important critics since the 1920s, including the New Critics and the Chicago School of Criticism, as we have seen in the previous lectures. So Russian formalists, they very much constitute, this objective criticism methodology, right? Now, let us have a look at the development of this school called Russian formalism. This school developed in the second decade of the 20th century, right? And two important societies or circles were founded by these scholars. One was the Opoyas, which was a society for the study of poetic language. There is a lot of debate about the establishment of the society, and critics have different opinions. Some critics believe that the society was founded in 1915, some believe it was founded in 1916, and some believe that it was founded in 1914. However, here we are considering 1914 as the year in which Opoyas was founded, right? So far as historical importance and influence of this school is concerned, you can understand that in 1914, even critics like T.S. Eliot and Richards in England or in that Anglo-American tradition, they had not appeared on the scene. So before their appearance on the critical scene, long before that, we can say, these Russian formalists had already evolved a kind of mechanism or methodology or approach towards literature, which can be called formalism or objective approach to literature, right? Like if we talk about that period, Crochet's aesthetics was the only important work which was very popular in those days. And we know that how Crochet's aesthetics, it was an exemplar of impressionistic approach to literature, right? The other surprising thing that we find that these Russian formalists, though they emerged in the second decade of the 20th century, but for quite a longer time, they remained, under the ground. For example, in 1957, that landmark work by Wimsatt and Brooks, Literary Criticism, A Short History, comes out. Just imagine that this work comes out in 1957. It gives an account of Crochet's aesthetics. Even this work gives an account of Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism, which was hardly available in print in those days. But there is no mention of Russian formalists at all. This is quite surprising, right? And But at the same time, if we talk about the significance of Russian formalists, we will find that their approach is so sound towards literature that very few critical movements are there which can match them or which can come closer to them. Right. So Chicago critics, they to some extent come closer to the Russian formalists. Despite this kind of superiority over such movements, they remained ignored for quite a considerable period of time. Right. And even we find that this term formalism was derogatorily, attached to them, right? The critics around them or people of that time, they thought that, this exclusion of social uh, element from literature, this decontextualization of literature from its socio-political context, it was quite ludicrous in analysis of literature. And if we look at the climate of Russia during 1917 or 16 or 15, when, a an environment was being created for the Bolshevik revolution, we can understand that during those times, if critics are talking about decontextualization of a text from all its social, political, ethical, moral concerns, this also, seems quite odd. However, this movement flourished with all its salient features during those times, right? We can find that till the 1960s, they remained buried, and during the 60s, critics like Zvetan Todorov, the American Frederick Jameson, the Italian Umberto Eco, and the French Julia Kristeva were very instrumental in rehabilitation of this movement called Russian formalism, right? Some important works in the early phase which restored the glory and reputation of the Russian formalists on the pan-European literary scene were Russian Formalist Criticism, 4 essays that was published in 1965, and this book was jointly edited by L.T. Lehman and Marion I. Rees, right? Or Eva M. Thompson's book, Russian Formalism and Anglo-American New Criticism, a comparative study. It was also very influential. Then Victor Ehrlich's Russian Formalism, History and Doctrine. These are some of the important texts which established the reputation of the Russian formalists and brought them to the attention of the international critical scenario. Now, let us have a look at the development of this movement, that these were the contours of development, but against which kind of backdrop this movement developed. So, we can say that for the development of this movement in the first or second decade of the 20th century, the impetus came from this movement called Futurism. As we all know that how Futurism was a movement which was concerned with the impact of this material advancement of society during the last 30-40 years of the late 19th century. Most significant scientific developments which have impacted human life, they occurred during the 1880s and 1890s, as we know. All the quick means of communication that we see around, the fastest manifestation of those things that we are seeing today around us. For example, a motor car or quick means of communication such as telegram or refrigerator or telephone. All these devices were invented around the same time. So, Futurism was a movement which came out of this ethos of material, scientific, industrial, technological advancement. And these critics, these futurists, they stand themselves against this decadent bourgeois culture which could be seen towards the end of the 19th century, right? They were also in opposition to this symbolist movement. They looked at the symbolist movement as an anguished, soul-searching movement, right? These futurists, they critiqued the mystical role of poets, the way poets were considered to be the guardians of the mystery, right? So, in place of absolute, Mayakovsky offered the noisy materialism of the machine age as the home of poetry. So, if poetry is produced in correspondence with the external reality of that particular time or of that given moment, so these futurists believe that poetry has to respond to these technological advancement, right. So, in this way, these futurists were opposed to realism. Realism was a movement, as we had seen how it had flourished during the second half of the 19th century, and how realism looked at the text as something which refers to the external reality, right. These futurists were opposed to that realism, and they argued for self-sufficiency of the work of art, and they talked about the self-sufficiency of the sounding pattern of words, right. So, in against that backdrop, what we see that now artist's role is seen as that of a proletarian. Artist is seen as a producer of a crafted object. For example, Dmitriev says that the artist is now simply a constructor and technician, a leader and foreman. The constructionist, they also develop their theory of factories of art, and they look at the production of art. So that is how what we see. This formalism can be seen in two phases. So far as the early phase is concerned, these formalists, these writers were occupied with the technical prowess or the crafting skill of a writer, as we have seen in context of that futuristic movement. They avoided this proletarian rhetoric but retained the mechanistic view of life. For example, Shlovatsky, one of the early proponents of this Russian formalism, he says, he is as much materialistic as any other futurist, and he defines literature as the sum total of all stylistic devices employed in it, right. So, that was the early phase of this movement called Russian formalism. 1917 is a watershed date when the Bolshevik Revolution takes place, and in this way, when this revolution takes place, these formalists are dealt with a kind of antagonism. In this way, this movement disintegrates, or these formalists were forced to leave their line of argument because a new kind of climate emerges which looks at literature as something that is tied to the ideology of society or politics. So, ideological assumptions become very important, and in the later phase of formalism, its character also changes. When we see the rise of works like Trotsky's Literature and Revolution, which was published in 1924, and this work is often seen as a defeat of pure formalism under the communist social command, that literature must stick to the social ideology or party literature. Such concepts were evolved, and there these formalists had to leave their line of argument. So, before it was ended by the revolution, we find a superb marriage of formalism and Marxism in Mikhail Bakhtin. We will be having a full-length discussion of Bakhtin towards the end of this discussion, and how Czech formalism, ended by the Nazis, and in this way, this movement completely disintegrated. The other antecedents of this formalism that we can see that how it also began with another important group called the Moscow Linguistic Circle, which was founded in 1915 in Moscow. And when this political revolution took place in 1917, many of these critics left Russia and they moved to the Czech Republic, and there they founded the Prague Linguistic Circle in 1926, of which Roman Jakobson, Jan Mukarovsky and Rein Willich were important critics, right. So, if we look at the formalistic ethos, we find that they look at literature in terms of its relationship with various components within it. For example, all the other components of the same work, how they look at literature, that how literature can be understood in context of the relationship of various elements with each other. The other level can be understood that how all the writings by the same author. So an interrelatedness of a work of author author by other works. In that way, they look at the text, or they look at that writing and the relationship of that writing with other writings of the same period. They look at a particular work, in which genre it is written, and what is the relationship. So in that genre, what are the other works? In this way, this interrelatedness is something that defines their formalistic method, right? So here we find that they look at literature as a network of relations. So aesthetic communicative functions of artistic expression become important from them, right? For example, the Prague School of Linguistics, they believe that all human activities are polyfunctional. They are coexisting together. However, one activity dominates over the other, and in this way it gives stimulus for ordering the hierarchy of various components. So in this way, the dominant becomes an important concept of the Russian formalism, and in this way the aesthetic function of dominant is countering the routine, right? So they use terms like foregrounding. So foregrounding is countering of routine and automatization. We will be talking about all these contexts or concepts in detail, right? Mukarovsky gives his famous term defamiliarization or de-automatization, right? How aesthetic function is achieved by that. So these Russian formalists believe that the distinctive feature is literariness in language. That is what they are looking for, that, right? So for example, if we see M.H. Abrams look at formalists in terms of opposition between literary or poetical language and ordinary language, right? So linguistics of literature versus linguistics of practical discourse. In these terms, Abrams tries to define, right? And this Roman Jakobson statement becomes a landmark for Russian formalists, that the object of study in literary science is not literature, but literariness. That is what makes a given work a work of art. So with these views, I come to the end of this introductory lecture to this movement called Russian formalism. In the next lecture, we will be continuing this introduction to Russian formalist school and various methods evolved by them. Thank you.